Well, having lived on Earth now 6 decades and some change, I thought it might be nice to finally check out the neighborhood. And so I've done a little continuing education in just seeing where I live. And one of the most immediate things you find in walking around the place is that you notice it has been around here for a little while. Where we happen to live, Big Fork, or just outside of it, it's a little over 100 years old. It was settled in 1901. Of course, it actually was occupied by first Americans long before that, 12,000 years, in fact. At the end of the last ice age, they were here. And their footprint goes back even further. Anthropologists believe that they were wandering around these parts 40,000 years ago, prior to the last ice age. And that is serious history. But it really is only a drop in the bucket, because if you ask people who actually know about these sorts of things, this fragile earth, our island home, as Eucharistic Prayer C puts it, is actually 4.567 billion, with a B, years old. And that is not only really, 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 really old, it's really, 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 really hard to believe. Because it doesn't fit into our scope of understanding. It doesn't fit into our scope of imagination. I have trouble accepting that the way you got to Big Fork in the early 1900s is that you took a paddle wheel boat from Polson up to the north end of the lake. And now someone wants me to appreciate the earth is that astronomical age. By the way, these are the same folks who tell us that the universe is 13.8 billion years old. Now some are saying it may be 13.6 billion. You know, 0.2 of a billion one way or another. That's still pretty old. Well, maybe the reason it's so hard to believe is that our view is very limited. Our view is minute. And instead, as believing as far as the eye can see, we are dealing with something called deep time, a phrase that was popularized by John McPhee in his 1981 book, Basin and Range, in which he said that if you stretch out your arm, the early English measure of a yard, remember from the king's tip of his nose to the end of his fingertip, and you consider the length of that arm to be the timeline of the world, again, 4.567 billion years old. And here we are over here, and this is where it all began. And then you take a nail file and you go, you have just wiped out the entirety of human existence in the timeline of the earth. There's all this other history of it that still stands there. Well, once you've wiped out the entirety of human existence as we understand it from the timeline of the Earth's history, you no longer really have the same kind of view that you would otherwise have if you were looking at an event that took place last Thursday. And because of that, our removal from being able to observe or even hear from someone who did observe concerning the origin of the Earth, doubt arises, doesn't it? How could the earth possibly be this old? And so we look for proof. Show us the proof, we say. And that proof can kind of bubble up in amazing ways. For example, we see rock that is 1.4 billion years old, going back nearly a third of the Earth's history, when we just travel to the east side of Glacier Park and we look at the Lewis overthrust, which was a result of collision of plates about 150 million years ago, one kind of rising up over the other. And then you throw in some further seismic activity, and then you have a couple million years of erosion, and then you can see for yourself that there it is, Chief Mountain, that most glorious mountain that just rises out of nowhere, and there it is right in front of you. 1.5 billion years of history. And if you begin to use scientific dating procedures, you can actually conclude that, in fact, the Earth has been around for quite a while. Or you can just take it on faith. that those telling you this kind of a thing know what they are talking about. And that, in a nutshell, is why I have some sympathies with poor St. Thomas. There is so much that is so hard to believe if, in fact, we are only relying on our own experience. The age of the earth is beyond us, as can be the resurrection of Christ. For that matter, I could hardly believe that the University of Washington Huskies beat Long Beach State 2.5 weeks ago because they were 13 points behind when I just couldn't take it any longer and turned off the television. I didn't want to deal with the agony. And yet, at the end, I turned the game back on with about 45 seconds, 30 seconds to go. And my God, we were winning 107 to 102. I would have never believed it had not I seen it with my own eyes or read about it in the Missoulian the next morning. Well, the story we hear of St. Thomas in John's Gospel is one that we visit every single second Sunday of Easter. And most of the time, our natural reaction is to wonder, how could Thomas have doubted? What was wrong with that guy? Why could he not get it? But one of the problems with this particular reading from the Gospels is that John and his followers had a really complicated relationship with St. Thomas and his followers. They both saw the world very differently, according to scholars, with respect to their own experience, kind of like the way we look at the world today. And you see that if you're looking for it in John's Gospel. In a nutshell, John was not very fond of Thomas, and he presents Thomas as knowing or wanting to know from inside himself, while John thinks that knowledge comes as that which is disclosed to you by God. And so this conflict made its way to this particular story. The second thing that's always useful is to remember the obvious. Thomas is no different from any of the others in that they also got to see Jesus before attesting to the resurrection. Remember, all of the others were in the upper room with the doors shut on the evening of the first day. They hadn't figured it out either prior to Jesus' appearance, even though Mary Magdalene had informed them of the good news and the fact that she had actually seen him. They might as well have told the disciples that the earth is 4.5678 billion years old. But then he appeared to them, and they believed. And following that, he appeared to Thomas. And Thomas believed. And then Thomas had that great proclamation, "My Lord and my God." He finally got it. Even so, blessed are those who have not seen and yet still believe. Well, the more I wrestle with this passage, the more I'm coming to the conclusion that while it is blessed to believe without seeing, we live in a world that just demands seeing. That's the way it is. It's an extraordinary thing to hear of someone just listening to the gospel and getting it. But in my experience, the last 35 years, those moments are very few and very far between, comparatively speaking. By nature, we are not unlike St. Thomas. We want to see proof. We're not unlike those who look at the age of the earth and actually want to see it in a rock someplace. And if that's the hand we're playing with today, then where do folks find such proof about the resurrection? And the answer, of course, is they find it in us. They find it in us. It is in the context of gathering here and all over the world, Sunday after Sunday, that people will find in the communion not only kinship with Jesus, but also kinship with one another. We are the friends he was talking about the night before he died. It's in the prayers in which we hold one another that people find him entering into the lives of the afflicted and the sick and the suffering. It is our gathering together when another is baptized or married or buried that folks see Jesus as the hope for ministry and partnership and everlasting life. It is in this place helping dogs and cats and stranded travelers and the homeless and those who are in need of medicine or food or companionship that others see Jesus by his telling the parable of people ministering to the king. Disclosing the world to Jesus is what we're about. And sometimes this disclosing Jesus can be as easy as just falling off a log that is floating down the river. It's not unlike looking at the sunrise over the Swan Mountains this morning, privileged to see it at about 7:45, and being filled with awe that sends a person immediately into an awareness that God not only exists, but God is continually to create with power and might and vibrancy. Sometimes it's that easy. And sometimes it feels like it takes effort akin to moving several mile thick crustal plates over millions upon millions of years, producing something like that Lewis overthrust in Glacier National Park. But this is where we are all called to be as a consequence of Easter. We have the privilege of being Christ to a world in everything we do, portraying in word and deed the forgiveness of sins, the existence of eternal life, and the promise of life everlasting. That's what we're all about, disclosing Jesus to the world. Yes, blessed art those who believe without seeing. I'm all for it, and so is Jesus. But today, when maybe there is a St. Thomas in the midst, and there will always be one, because after all, a lot of us, myself very much included, are a lot like him. We know that we as the community are the backup. We are God's contingency plan. We are those who will appear in the upper rooms of the world today. Those who need to see the risen Christ can find him in us, engaged in the ministry of Jesus, and as a result, similarly find themselves blessed as well. And if you take all that into consideration, that in itself, I think, makes for a very happy Easter. Amen.